Are you concerned about the growing influence of political extremism, hyperpolarization, and misinformation? Well, you're not alone. This is the American Values Coalition podcast, where we explore the root causes of these societal ills and help you with strategies to counter them.
Is it safe to assume that because we have a constitution, we won't lose our democracy?
No, the Constitution is a very solid framework for governance, but as I tell my students, so much of the administration and implementation of our Constitution depends on the people working within the constitutional framework.
My guest today is Professor Dan Bennett, or Daniel Bennett for his author name, Professor of Political Science at John Brown University, and we'll be talking about his book, Uneasy Citizenship, Embracing the Tension in Faith and Politics. For those of you watching the recording, I'll hold up the cover for you. That's what it looks like. Dan Bennett, welcome to the very first AVC podcast.
Thanks, Knapp. It's an honor. Setting the bar one way or another.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. So you tell a little bit of the story in one of the chapters about what inspired the writing of this book. So can you share a little bit about that? How did this book come about?
Right. So I've always been interested at the intersection of faith and politics, even from a relatively young age, or certainly getting into high school and as a college student. And, certainly as a political scientist, these questions have always been interesting to me. But I believe I wrote that in 2018 or 2019, I think it was 2019, at a conference with the American Enterprise Institute, we were hearing from the political scientist Patrick Deneen for a talk on his book, Why Liberalism Failed. And the book was really interesting, thought-provoking, controversial in a way, kind of paved the way for some of his, what I would consider to be post-liberal thinking, not political ideology, but more the framework for how we ought to structure a governmental system. And in that conference, they're batting around ideas about how, the liberal order has failed the West. A focus on individual liberties and individual rights has ended up somewhat ironically supplanting the foundation of these systems themselves. And I started thinking about, where that leaves people of faith moving forward. And I remember jotting down a phrase, uneasy citizenship, in a notebook. And I've looked everywhere for that notebook. I can't find it. But that was kind of the beginning of thinking through a more organized and detailed project that would inevitably take the shape of the book that came out last year.
Yeah, and I was able to follow you on Substack as you were writing this book, and you had helped your readers and future book purchasers with what you had going on and keeping them up to date. And I want to get back to the argument about democracy, but first I wanted to ask, so you're a politics expert. You seek to apply your Christian faith to your politics. There's a lot of books out there about Christians should take this position on this political issue, but that's not this book. Why? I guess why isn't that this book? Why didn't you want to write that kind of book?
Well, I wanted to lean into what I saw as my strengths and my experience. So, I'm certainly not a pastor. I'm not a theologian. I'm not an ethicist. I'm a political scientist. I'm a social scientist. And so a lot of what I study is in the context of American politics and political institutions and our traditions. And so, I've been able to read a lot over the years about the challenges that our system is currently facing, whether it's by the design of the systems themselves, deep-seated institutional problems, or problems stemming from kind of the bottom up with public opinion and political polarization, and how these things might intersect to pose some real challenges moving forward. And there's a chapter in the book about this, reflecting on some of the cultural challenges that exist for people of faith or people adhering to a more, whether you want to call it a conservative or traditional Christian ethic or worldview, as I generally tend to do, not dismissing these concerns as overblown or dismissing them because we haven't been facing the serious persecution of other Christian groups somewhere else in the world, but also acknowledging that while these challenges are real and certainly are going to be something we deal with in the years ahead, there's also an opportunity that we have now as Christians, as people of faith, to speak into our cultural and political processes in different and hopefully faithful and productive ways, not necessarily, for the sake of winning every argument or winning every political battle, but adopting a more faithful public witness as people of faith in an increasingly post-Christian society. So, there's a chapter at the end where I try to answer some, big questions. Can Christians vote for Democrats, or can, Christians vote for, in good conscience, vote for Donald Trump or something like that? But the market is saturated, like you said, with books about those questions. And I feel like we're kind of just repeating ourselves and having these same kinds of circular arguments. But for me, writing as a political scientist, I wanted the opportunity to write to people of faith, to churches, to small groups, sharing my expertise, but also offering a hopeful vision for politics ahead, regardless of who happens to be occupying our halls of power.
And you also have a chapter where you go back to the Patrick Dinging argument and some others who are now taking the position more of an saying Christians shouldn't support some of these democratic norms, but instead should support using political power for Christian purposes, is the argument. Why should Christians support democracy in your view? Is that a Christian position to support, well, let's say democracy, but also capital L liberalism, the values that support our democracy, such as freedom of religion and so forth?
Yeah, I would say that, you can be a faithful Christian and not necessarily live in a small d democratic society or a liberal order, prior to the, if we're calling it the Enlightenment or the rise of small d democratic and Republican, small r Republican systems of government. Certainly people of faith lived under those times and operated under the systems in which they were situated. But the argument that I make here is that a small d democratic systems with a classical liberal framework emphasizing consent of the governed, individual freedoms, the free market, these have been an extraordinarily beneficial and successful system for people of faith to operate in terms of providing a religious marketplace, the growth of evangelism in the United States, particularly as a country that doesn't have an established church. And then simply put, the values of pluralism that often accompany liberal and democratic societies, where we have the opportunity to engage, attempt to persuade, and argue for our positions rather than seek to impose these values on a population that doesn't want them or is resistant to them. I think Russell Moore once said, I'm paraphrasing him at a Southern Baptist conference once, where he effectively said something like, nobody's ever become a Christian, through the sword. A genuine person of faith because of coercion or demanding that they become a Christian. So I understand the frustration of liberalism, and certainly that's part of the challenge in which we live as Christians. But, I don't know if there's any truth to the Churchill quote about democracy or if it's apocryphal, but in some sense, liberalism is the worst system there is, except for everything else we've ever tried. And I'm convinced of this. And I think people of faith have to be willing to make tweaks on the margins rather than throwing everything out and starting over in the hopes of gaining political power now that we happen to be moving into a position of cultural minority, potentially.
So what's more important for a Christian, the positions, the political positions you take, or the way you go about your political engagement?
Well, I believe it's the posture that we bring into the public square. Christians are a diverse group. The kingdom of God is large and diverse. If we look just in the United States, the difference between the white evangelical tradition and the Black Protestant tradition, there's a lot of overlap on theology and views of Scripture, the person of Jesus, et cetera, within those groups of Christians. But of course, our politics look very different. If you're a white evangelical, you're going to vote very differently and hold certain policy views a lot more tightly than your Black Protestant brothers and sisters who are going to have a very different view on policy and government. I have a hard time making the argument that just because a neighbor of mine in the pews disagrees with me on a policy question, that somehow throws into question the sincerity or the robustness of their faith. Regardless of the positions that we hold, I think Christians have a responsibility and certainly a unique opportunity to bring with them a posture that is identifiable with a Christian worldview, one rooted in hope, one rooted in a sense of justice, rooted in confidence, but also in humility. And, we're going to disagree on policies. I think some issues, we can disagree on an outcome to a specific issue or a policy outcome without disagreeing on the importance of that issue. We might just take a different tack in getting to a preferred outcome. So ultimately, I do think it's a matter of posture and the attitudes that we bring with us into the political sphere. especially today, given the extreme polarization we're seeing, the potential for extremism on both the left and the right in American politics. I think I write somewhere in the book that we have an opportunity as Christians to confound the world's expectations of what politics is capable of. And so that's something that is always a challenge, but it's definitely a really cool opportunity.
Okay, so let's tie those last two questions together. So you're saying our posture is what's important. We're blessed to live in a democracy, and we are blessed by pluralism. So how is it what is the postures? What are the things that Christians can do if they want to continue to live in a democracy, want to support our democratic institutions and to support pluralism, support religious freedom? What are some of those things, those types of postures?
Yeah, so certainly being politically engaged and civic-minded is something I think all Christians should aspire to. When Jesus, speaks of the Great Commission at the end of Matthew, he's not talking about political engagement, but political engagement is not necessarily opposed to the call in the Great Commission. We are called to be in the world, to go into the world and into our communities, and certainly, for the sake of the kingdom. But one of the ways we can do that, in addition to our individual evangelism, and sharing our good news and the hope that we have in Jesus, is encouraging the flourishing of our communities, is encouraging the good and seeking justice for the orphan, the widow, the foreigner, the good of our neighbors. And this is really difficult to separate from practical political decision-making. The votes that we cast have very tangible results, or at least they have the potential to have tangible results in our communities. So at the very least, I do think there is a call for Christians to be civic-minded and politically engaged. This doesn't mean we all become political experts or run for office or become experts on the latest legislation coming out of all of the different levels of our government. But we should be at least concerned with the welfare of our communities. As for postures, there's a chapter in the book where I dig into this, emphasizing a humble posture, but also one of strength, essentially holding tightly to the essentials of our faith and how that affects certain attitudes towards policy, but also being humble enough to genuinely hear and learn from others with whom we might disagree on those things. It doesn't mean we adopt essentially adopt a morally relativistic attitude towards the world, but adopting that posture can help us learn and potentially even update our beliefs in light of what we learn from our neighbors. Certainly seeking justice and the flourishing of our communities more than political victories is a posture that I think Christians can take in. It's really easy these days to fall into the trap of, what we might call negative partisanship, or seeking the loss or the defeat of your enemy, even at the expense of your own side's victories. I like to illustrate this in terms of sports, right? I'm a big sports fan, and I'm a fan of the Oregon Ducks. And it's great when we have a good season, and we had a really nice season this year, but I would almost like to beat the Washington Huskies more than having a successful season. I want my opponents to lose in sports. It's enjoyable almost, even more so than my own team winning. And we're seeing that more and more in our politics, where people's attitudes toward politics aren't tied to specific policy gains or outcomes from their political party, but rather seeing their opponents lose becomes the default position. Some of the listeners may have heard the phrase, owning the libs is kind of the pinnacle of political achievement. If only we can make them sad. If only we can make our political opponents angry or cry. I think that's unhealthy for our political systems. That's certainly not sustainable in the long term, particularly in an increasingly pluralistic society. And so we can approach politics differently as Christians, seeking to avoid those types of attitudes and really leaning into the perspective of, how can my advocacy and the views that I hold, how can that really affect the betterment of my community? So those are just two examples, but things that are probably not prioritized by the world in the political systems these days. But as Christians, we can try to change that conversation.
Why not think about what's best for me, in my politics, and think about okay, when I go to the voting booth, let's vote for the guy who's going to lower the taxes in my tax bracket, right? I mean, anything wrong with that?
Well, sure. I mean, depending on how you're describing or at least conceptualizing individual or in collective flourishing, I don't think there's anything wrong as as people in politics, being about self-interest to an extent, right? We all are going to prioritize the self-interest of our interests in terms of individually or our families. That's just kind of human nature. But we do have to consider how those decisions will ultimately affect the lives of others. I think the immigration debate's a really good example of this. I might, on the one hand, think it's important that we have a more secure border system, particularly on our southern border, to make it less appealing or appetizing for people to try to circumvent those legal processes. But I can't forget that a lot of the elected officials adopting or endorsing those positions today are often pairing that with policies that I might otherwise also see as draconian in terms of, sending people who have been here for 20 or 30 years, potentially not, having gone through the right processes, but otherwise are contributing members of the community, and that could affect them in a very negative way. Or even something like, I think taxes was an example, right? I want to have more money to be able to, either support my family or otherwise tithe to local churches or provide to local charity organizations. We might view lower taxes as part of, community flourishing. At the same time, I think there are plenty of Christians out there who would support a higher tax system in general if it supports stronger social safety nets for the poor and the marginalized in our midst. And I think both of those positions are potentially compatible with Christian teaching on caring for the poor, but the rationale behind it really does have to matter, and that's where I think our postures matter too.
Yeah, it is. You're talking about a different way of thinking about politics than you get it seems like, during election season, like all the interviews and all the polls and everything is all geared toward having people think about their voting being tied to what's best for them, right? It's all just sort of built into our whole culture. It's a different way of thinking about politics to think about, okay, so instead of thinking about what's good for me, it's like, okay, what's good for other people, right? Not just me. What's good for all of society? What's best for the common good?
Yeah, I think so, because there could be instances where, what's best for me or what's best for you, could align with what we believe is best in the best interest of our community. But there could be instances where, frankly, let's say I don't have children, and yet there's a bond measure in the local community that would raise a certain amount of money for public schools, even though I don't have kids in school. Maybe I see the value of supporting public education as a way of advancing the economic and social mobility of people in my area. So that's a pretty good example, right? I might choose to vote for that and pay a little bit extra sales tax every time I go to the grocery store or fill up my car, knowing that it's kind of a down payment or a long-term investment. Now, that doesn't mean, I don't think we can ever be solely altruistic when it comes to our politics. We're human, we're fallen, but I think it behooves us to at least take that extra couple minutes or even a few seconds and think, how does this affect people beyond just me?
So let's go back to this democratic norms for a second, because I've been shocked by just what I've observed to be like the erosion of democratic norms over the past decade or so. And so I used to do what you do. Like I was a professor. I taught a ton of this intro to American government course, right? Lots of students. And I think if I were to teach it today, it would be very different, because I feel like, well, first of all, I feel like a failure because that's where people should learn democratic norms, is this course, right? And so I feel like, we had some responsibility. You have responsibility, and political science, professors have this responsibility. But I just kind of assumed that it was sort of in our culture that our students already knew this and already kind of supported democratic norms. I felt like it was just sort of in the air that we breathe, and I didn't really need to teach it, So I'm wondering, it's been a while since I taught, but I'm wondering for you, over the past 10 years, as you've observed this, has it changed the way you teach American politics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I certainly have to be a little bit more explicit about advocating for certain things. And it makes me a little uncomfortable, frankly, as a professor, to advocate in the classroom, right? Certainly I would never, as a professor, tell my students, this is how I'm voting in the upcoming election. You all need to do the same. Or, you don't care about the country, or even worse, we're at a distinctly Christian university, then you're not a Christian if you don't vote the way that I do. So I don't do that. But, at the same time, I think it's fair to, to just objectively state that what we saw on January 6, 2021 was a catastrophe. And it was a major milestone and potentially even license for future disregard of some of our important traditions about the peaceful transfer of power. This is not the same thing, rather, as saying, I don't think there's any criticism of Joe Biden's presidency. I don't think Donald Trump ever did anything good as president. That's not what I'm saying when I talk about democratic norms and the evils of January 6th. But I've gotten more comfortable speaking out against some of these tendencies to disregard some of these longstanding traditions, norms, or checkpoints in our electoral process. And certainly a lot of this has come in the last decade with Donald Trump's brash vision of politics and treating politics, more as a gladiator sport than previous Republican candidates have. And a lot of his supporters are thankful for that. But then there's also this effort, and it appears on the political left too, to an extent. During the 2024 campaign, there were some efforts by some states that attempted to say, well, Donald Trump can't actually appear on our ballot because of, his actions on January 6th, even though, he wasn't convicted, he was impeached, and that's sufficient under the 14th Amendment to remove him from our ballot. I mean, I think those kinds of things, certainly aren't as visibly distressing and upsetting as January 6th, but they still are these little points along the road of saying, we're just going to use these systems and erode some of these norms to keep people we don't like out of the political sphere. Look, at the end of the day, voters in 2024 said, you know what, we prefer Donald Trump again. And that wasn't certainly the way I would have voted. And I'm just hopeful we can, make it through 4 years with some of these norms still intact. But yeah, to answer your question in kind of a really roundabout way, a lot of the students that I encounter in the classroom tend to be a little bit disengaged from politics. They've kind of checked out. A lot of these students have essentially come of age, and all they've known is Donald Trump on the political scene. When they're turning, 10, 11, or 12, that's when Donald Trump announced his candidacy for president. So he's been with them all their memory, all their working memory, really. And so it has been important to say, this is how things have traditionally gone in our country. The certification of the Electoral College has generally been not very controversial. I was pleased to see Vice President Harris preside over these results in a way that harkened back to a pre-January 6th environment. I was very grateful that we saw some of the same pomp and circumstance of the peaceful transfer of power on Inauguration Day, even though it was a little surreal. And, I don't know if we'll see that again in 2028 if Donald Trump's favored successor loses, or if they'll be fighting again. Because ultimately norms don't matter if both sides don't respect them. And so that's the danger, I think, long term of disregarding these norms, is it makes it easier for both sides to essentially check out and say, well, why are we playing by these rules if our opponents aren't? And it just kind of escalates from there.
Is it safe to assume that because we have a constitution, we won't lose our democracy?
No, the Constitution is a very solid framework for governance. But as I tell my students, so much of the administration and implementation of our Constitution depends on the people working within the constitutional framework. And a lot of our constitutional rules state that the president shall take office on January 20th and all that. So much of the process of going into confirming election results and maintaining that people can appear on ballots or whatnot, these are all norms that are either respected by political parties or eventually ruled on by our judicial system. And all it takes is folks who just say, we don't want to deal with this anymore, or a legal system that says we're tired of being the last, bastion for, safeguarding these democratic norms. We're moving on from this. I do think it's silly to think that the United States is somehow not susceptible to the same sort of democratic backsliding that we see in other countries around the world. I'm optimistic that we are in a better position, just given the length of our Constitution, the rootedness of some other institutions, and frankly, the behavior of a lot of our elected officials on both sides of the political aisle. But look, these folks won't serve forever. And if we get elected officials, who came of age in this environment and really start asking themselves, what's the point of all this? We could backslide and disregard some of these things a lot faster than a lot of people think.
Okay, so we're recording this on January 20th, so that means we're 9 days into the Trump presidency. Just briefly for the last question, just looking broadly at the first 9 days, what are your thoughts? What are your impressions of where we've been so far in the Trump presidency?
I'm so used to thinking in terms of the first 100 days that going back to the first 9 days feels a little slim, but
it feels like 100 days to me.
It does. There's a lot going on, and that actually speaks to my to my answer. Really, I was struck, and I've been struck by how organized, efficient, and driven the second Trump administration has been relative to the first. Back in 2017, there were the typical executive orders that all Republican presidents sign. There were also a lot of hiccups with the new administration. Donald Trump getting distracted by news coverage about crowd size at the inauguration, little things that distracted from an efficient governing agenda. And we haven't seen this in over 100 years, where you see someone who had previously run for re-election lose and then win 4 years later. So in one sense, we're getting the experience and the familiarity with the levers of power that a former president will have. At the same time, he's rescinding policies from the previous administration and imposing new policies in a much more efficient way, certainly than we saw, 8 years ago. And so that's been surprising, I think. I don't know if it's been surprising, but it's definitely been noteworthy. Certainly hasn't disappointed his supporters on immigration issues. He's gone big on a lot of these questions, specifically the birthright citizenship question, which I think will ultimately be decided by the courts. And I would be surprised if that is upheld, just given the length of precedent and language in the 14th Amendment. I think birthright citizenship is here to stay. If we don't like it, we could always amend the Constitution, right? And then the other thing that just came up yesterday, I believe, the memo to the executive branch, essentially telling federal employees, look, if you want to leave, if you want to resign, you can do that. And we'll pay you 8 months benefits and salary and send you on your merry way. It's really hard to remove career employees from the federal bureaucracy. There's a lot of protections, and rightfully so. We don't want to just transition the bureaucracy every 4 years. And so this strikes me as a somewhat innovative, but also potentially concerning development. There might be some people who say, I don't want to put up with this for 4 years. I'm out. I'll take my salary and go find a new job. But it also circumvents the legal challenges of firing people. But that's something you get, I think, with a more mature, emboldened Trump 2.0 administration. And if you're a critic of him, I think that's going to make you really, really nervous over the next few months. We critiqued him in 2017 as impulsive, distracted, unbecoming of the presidency. But what happens when he's surrounding himself with people who really know how to run government? And he himself has the advantage of 4 years of experience. So I'll leave it there for now. 9 days, it's short, but man, it feels like a long time, like you said.
Yeah, maybe we'll revisit it with the 100 days or something like that. All right. Professor Dan Bennett, the book is Uneasy Citizenship. Tell people where they can find your blog and anything else you have coming up.
Well, you can find me on Substack at Uneasy Citizenship. I'm there with all the other people attempting to scream and write into the void. And I'm trying to keep readers up to date on speakers we're bringing in to JBU this coming semester. We've got a great schedule planned, including on March 18th, we'll be hearing from former Governor Asa Hutchinson on campus as he speaks about the relationship between faith and public service. So looking forward to that, but that's just one future speaker of many this upcoming semester.
Sounds good. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.